morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Czech National Bank, let me welcome you to a regular, though this time virtual, meeting with analysts. However, its goal is the same as under normal standard circumstances: to elaborate on the last monetary policy decision of the Czech National Bank Board and to present a new macroeconomic forecast. First, I'd like to ask you to stay muted at all times during the video conference unless I give you the floor. Also, should you wish to ask a question today, please use the chat function in the lower right corner of your screen. Starting from now, you can send only me a short message by entering the word question in the chat field. For the sake of an easier identification, please enter also your name and the name of your company in the chat field. I will be inviting you to pose a question in the order in which you ask for the floor. Now let's move to introducing our speakers. Today, they are Czech National Bank Board member Sorry? Today they are Czech National Bank Board member Tomáš Holub.
Hi.
Executive Director of the Monetary Department Petr Král.
Hello to everyone.
And Director of the Macroeconomic Forecasting Division Karel Musil.
Good morning.
In line with the tradition, we shall start with our new quarterly forecast, which will be presented today by Deputy Executive Director of the Monetary Department, Luboš Komárek. Luboš is now located in a separate room, sitting alone, which allows him to speak without a face mask. Luboš, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to present our May inflation report today, which is significantly affected by the current dramatic domestic and foreign situation
Luboš,
regarding the coronavirus pandemic. The outline of my roughly 30 minutes long presentation is the following. I will start with the assumptions of the forecast, then I will move to the core part of this presentation. It means to our new macroeconomic forecast. The third part of my presentation compares our new forecast with the previous one, which was prepared before the coronavirus pandemic. In the subsequent two parts, I will present two alternative scenarios of future economic development. They have moved to the forefront in the environment of high uncertainty concerning the duration of the quarantine measures and the further evolution of the epidemiological situation. The first one, as you can see, is the scenario of prolonged pandemic, while the second is the scenario with the second wave of the pandemic.
We are having technical problems. We are having technical problems, so please give us a second to resolve it.
Okay, I will try again. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to present our May inflation report today, which is significantly affected by the current dramatic domestic and foreign situation regarding the coronavirus pandemic. The outline of my roughly 30 minutes long presentation is the following. I will start with the assumptions of the forecast, then I will move to the core part of this presentation. It means to our new macroeconomic forecast. The third part of my presentation compares our new forecast with the previous one, which was prepared before the coronavirus pandemic. In the subsequent two parts, I will present two alternative scenarios of future economic development. They have moved to the forefront in the environment of high uncertainty concerning the duration of the quarantine measures and the further evolution of the epidemiological situation. The first one, as you can see, is scenario of prolonged pandemic, while the second is the scenario with a second wave of the pandemic. The first assumption of our forecast is related to external environment outlook. As you can see from charts on the left, GDP in the effective euro area will drop markedly in the second quarter. From its year-on-year perspective, this decline will then start to moderate. The effective euro area will contract by almost 7% overall this year. In the next year, it will partly recover from an extremely low level, rising by more than 4%. However, as you can see from the graphs, the recovery will not be enough to GDP in the effective euro area to return to the pre-pandemic level. And this is important information for you. The output gap in the effective euro area will thus remain visibly negative and will close only gradually. The development of foreign nominal indicators, it means price of oil, PPI, interest rates in the euro area, and the exchange rate of the main exchange on the currency market, it means euro-dollar, is commented on this slide. As you can see from the left bottom panel, the price of oil fell dramatically in the first quarter as a result of failed OPEC plus talks in early March and a drop in demand due to economic impacts of the measures to counter the pandemic. The decline in industrial producer prices, as is visible from the top left panel, this year will be due mainly to a negative contribution of the energy component, reflecting the collapse of oil prices. The core component will also contribute to the decline and due to the expected fall in economic activity. The outlook of 3 months Euribor remains stable, and the shadow rate will shift to more negative values due to the launch of the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, which you can see from top right panel. And finally, we assume that the euro will appreciate slightly against the US dollar, which is clear from the bottom right panel. The second assumption, general assumption of our forecast is related to the fiscal policy. We assume, as is clear from the chart at the top, that government consumption will reflect a rise in expenditure on materials, in the health and emergency services, and temporarily higher compensation of frontline state employees. Fiscal stabilization policy is being implemented through substantial support for household consumption in this year. We also assume this year a positive fiscal impulse, which is largely a result of the extraordinary measures taken to support the economy due to epidemic. I mean mainly due to the program Antivirus, the program 25, and the care allowance. The forecast expects a negative fiscal impulse in the next year, and only tax loss carryback will have a supported effect in 2021. The second part of my presentation is, of course, the main part, which consists of the baseline scenario of our new macroeconomic forecast. I start with the real economy. It means with overall view of the GDP forecast, which you can graphically see from this fan chart. The main message is the following. The Czech economy will fall into a deep decline this year as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. As we know, a large part of the economy has been switched off since the end of the first quarter due to the government quarantine measures, production shutdowns in some companies, and a significant drop in external demand. The decline in economic activity will begin to moderate in the second half of this year, according to this baseline scenario. In this chart, you can see the initial development of the Czech GDP in levels. Using levels not only in this slide but also in other variables is in our view very useful for better understanding this unprecedented situation regarding the coronavirus pandemic. It is quite visible that GDP will markedly fall by 8% this year as a whole, and the economic activity will nonetheless start to increase again as from the middle of this year. However, overall economic activity will not have reached the end 2019 level, even by the end of the forecast horizon. The chart below in this slide shows the structure of our GDP growth. As is very clear, all expenditure components except government consumption will contribute to a significant drop in GDP in the first half of this year. The output gap of the Czech economy, which was calculated by means of our small structural model, will open into significantly negative values in the first half of this year, and the potential output will also decrease temporarily. In the following chart, we can see the recent history and prediction of all four components of aggregate demand. First, household consumption will slow this year as a result of government pandemic measures and the subsequent rapid cooling of the labor market. Later, it means after the impact of the quarantine measures subsidies, the decline in household consumption will begin to moderate. Graphically, in levels, you can see the development of household consumption from top left panel. The next, in the top right panel, is investment, also from the perspective of levels. The effects of the coronavirus pandemic and the sharp deterioration in corporate sentiment will be adversely reflected in private investment activity. Government investment will conversely mainly modest grow. I don't know if you hear me in this slide. I don't know if you hear me in this slide, if I was quite clear. Můžu? I don't know if you hear me when I describe this slide regarding the aggregate demand components. Anyway, I will start again that in the following chart we can see the recent history and prediction of all four components of aggregate demand. Household consumption will slow this year as a result of government pandemic measures and the subsequent rapid cooling of the labor market. Later, it means after the impact of the quarantine measures subsidies, the decline in household consumption will begin to moderate. Graphically, in levels, you can see the development of household consumption from the top left panel. Next, in the top right panel is investment, also from the perspective of levels. The effects of coronavirus pandemic and the sharp deterioration in corporate sentiment will be adversely reflected in private investment activity. And I have to say that government investment will conversely maintain modest growth. From the bottom panels, it is also clear that exports of goods and services will drop sharply as a result of the freeze in external demand. Import growth will decline significantly this year due to the drop in domestic demand and export. Now, I will move on the description of labor market in the Czech Republic, which is, of course, directly connected to the already discussed GDP. The chart at the top presents the development of employment and unemployment. As you can see, employment will decline appreciably until the end of the next year, owing to the fall in economic activity. The unemployment rate will increase rapidly, peaking at the start of next year. More market growth in unemployment because of the recently very tight Czech labor market, with the lowest unemployment rate in the EU, will be prevented by layoffs of foreign workers and the high initial number of vacancies. Wage growth in market sectors will slow significantly this year and will then recover. Wage growth in non-market sectors will remain high this year. One of the most important variables for the small open economy is, of course, the development of the exchange rate. Crucial for the Czech Republic especially is the exchange rate of the Czech koruna against the euro. From our fan chart on the left of this slide for the koruna-euro exchange rate, you can see that, firstly, the exchange rate will remain over the entire forecast horizon close to the current level, to which is weakened after the pandemic broke out. Second, the exchange rate forecast for the second quarter of this year is set at Czech koruna against euro 27.2. The exchange rate will remain close to its current level over the entire forecast horizon due to the worse foreign and domestic economic outlook and narrower interest rate differential. And this is the third message from this slide. Now I am slowly moving on to our targeted variable, it means inflation. I will start with the description of inflation pressures in the Czech economy. As can be seen from the chart at the top, growth in total cost will initially jump temporarily on the back of weaker exchange rate, but will later slow sharply due to subdued domestic inflationary pressures. The resumption of the GDP growth in the second half of this year will be lead to a recovery in the contribution of the domestic economy. Growth in domestic cost will initially almost come to a halt due to the freeze of the economy and then gradually return to its steady state level. This you can see from the first chart. From the chart on the bottom, which describes nominal marginal cost in the intermediate goods sector, it can be seen that the fall in domestic demand is reflected in a decline in the contribution of the price of capital, which is only partially offset by continued wage growth and a significant decline in labor efficiency linked with the limited usability of employees. By means of this slide, I would like to comment on our new headline inflation forecast. As you can see, headline inflation will fall from current higher levels below the upper boundary of the tolerance band in the second quarter and it will continue to slow in the remainder of this year. This will be due to all its components. There is one exception, which is food prices, whose growth will temporarily rise in the second quarter. Inflation will temporarily drop slightly below 2% at the start of next year, despite an easing of the monetary conditions in both the exchange rate and interest rates components. Headline inflation will then increase slightly and return close to the target in 2021. Finally, we can compare the chart with headline and monetary policy relevant inflation. Monetary policy relevant inflation will be below headline inflation over the entire forecast horizon, as the first round effects of changes to indirect taxes will be slightly positive. It will return to the 2% target during the second half of the next year. From this slide, we can see the decomposition of very relevant subparts of inflation. It means core inflation, food prices, administrative prices, and fuel prices is visible. On the top left panel is a chart with core inflation, which will slow considerably on account of declining domestic price pressures. In addition to the expected price decline in services, this will be due to the gradual worsening labor market situation. Food price inflation will reflect strong consumer demand and higher cost amid lower supply of some items in the near future and not decrease until late 2020 and early 2021. This is quite clear from the chart on the top right panel. The recent high growth in administrative prices will slow further this year. The main reasons are gradual decline in the currently high growth in electricity prices and a decrease in heat prices, which you can see from bottom left panel. And finally, domestic fuel prices will also fall significantly due to the collapse of global oil prices, as I already mentioned, and you can see this from the bottom right panel. The final fan chart, which you can see from this slide, shows the interest rate path for 3 months PRIBOR. It is very clear from this fan chart that consistent with the forecast is further decline in domestic market interest rates in the second quarter. This decline in interest rates is a continuation of the sharp drop recorded at the end of March and reflects the effects of government quarantine measures on the domestic economy as well as the significantly worse external outlook. However, the decline in rates will be slowed by the recent sharp weakening of the koruna, which is contributing to an easing of the overall monetary conditions. According to our forecast, interest rate will then remain broadly stable over the rest of the forecast horizon. The third part of my presentation traditionally compares our new forecast with the previous one. It means with the pre-pandemic forecast. As we know, the current economic situation is dominated by the strong global and domestic reaction to the coronavirus pandemic, which was unforeseen by the previous forecast. To freeze of economic activity in the domestic economy as well as abroad will lead to a sharp drop in GDP this year, while moderate growth was predicted in our February report. You can see this from top right panel. The large drop in foreign demand and increase in overall uncertainty leads to a notably weaker euro-koruna exchange rate, which is very visible from bottom right panel. The deterioration in the labor market is reflected in slower wage growth than we expected in our previous forecast, which is graphically demonstrated in the bottom left panel. Finally, in the top left panel, we can see the comparison of the new and previous inflation forecast. As is expected, weaker overall cost pressures are reflected in lower inflation this year. However, the monetary policy reaction together with endogenous exchange rate depreciation will ensure the return of inflation to the 2% target in the next year. In this slide, I will compare our new interest rate forecast with the previous one. As is clear, the new forecast contains a dramatically lower path of domestic interest rates due to the economic impacts of the pandemic. This you can see from the black columns in the chart at the top, which compare the new and previous path of interest rates from our DSG model. The contribution of the worse external demand outlook is the dominant factor fostering lower market interest rates. The contribution of the short-term inflation outlook and the effect of the sharp reduction in interest rates at the end of the first quarter due to monetary policy shock foster slightly lower interest rate too. Expert adjustments in the current prediction are quite visible. We have to see this. We have to say this and act overall towards higher rates this year, mainly due to a significant decrease in labor efficiency. These expert adjustments reflecting the sharp contraction of the Czech economy and the cooling of the labor market this year will persist in negative territory in the next year. The penultimate part of my presentation describes the first mentioned scenario. It means the scenario of prolonged pandemic. I would like to begin by describing the foreign and domestic assumption behind our first scenario. From the foreign perspective, we assume that, firstly, the pandemic recedes more slowly and has longer-lasting negative impacts abroad. Secondly, the government restrictions in Germany and Slovakia are extended by 2 to 3 weeks. The scenario therefore assumes a slower return to growth of economic activity in the affected euro area. Third, a longer-lasting pandemic will also worsen consumer confidence and business sentiment, which you can compare with the baseline scenario. From the domestic view, we assume that, firstly, the domestic government restrictions are extended by about 1 month relative to the baseline scenario. Second, the restrictions should be fully lifted by the end of the summer holidays, except for tourism-related measures. Third assumption, the longer-lasting measures will lead to a larger decline in economic activity and a greater deterioration in the labor market. And the fourth one, these previous factors will be accompanied by the longer-lasting in both households and business sentiment. The external environment behind our first scenario is following. Due to the worse economic growth, as you can see from the top left and right panel, and demand outlooks, the oil price is lower than in the forecast. This will lead to a sharper fall in the energy component of the PPI. The recovery of the core component of the PPI will also be slower than in baseline scenario because of more subdued demand pressures. We also assume in this scenario that the ECB will respond to the worse economic growth outlook for the euro area by broadening and prolonging its asset purchases under the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program. The ECB response will be reflected in the shadow 3-month Euribor rate, which is consistent with our methodology to take past ECB programs into account during the so-called quantitative easing period. It is obvious that the shadow 3-month Euribor rate will be lower than in the baseline scenario over the entire forecast horizon. You can see this from bottom left panel. The development of domestic economy in our first scenario is following. A longer-lasting pandemic will be reflected in a deeper economic decline, as you can see from left top panel, which is again for better illustration there in levels, and greater cooling of the labor market, especially this year. Headline inflation, please you can see this from the top right panel, will be lower. There are two main reasons for that. The first is the lower wage growth, and the second, weaker domestic price pressures, despite a weaker koruna. The comparison of baseline path of the exchange rate and the path of this scenario is prolonged pandemic is in bottom left panel. A weaker koruna will improve Czech exporters' price competitiveness and thus partly neutralize the impacts of the lower external demand on the domestic economy. Finally, the reaction of the central bank is visible from the bottom right panel. The longer-lasting pandemic scenario requires greater monetary policy easing in the interest rate component. This will foster a return of inflation from below close to the 2% target over the monetary policy horizon. The final part of my presentation describes the most pessimistic scenario. It means the scenario with a second wave of the pandemic. First, I would like again to start the foreign and domestic assumption behind our second very pessimistic scenario. From the foreign view, we assume that, firstly, the scenario of a resurgent in the pandemic expects the first wave of the pandemic to fade more gradually and the second wave to emerge in late of this year. It means we assume something like W-shaped scenario. Government quarantine measures abroad will reintroduce for about 2 months, but on a much smaller scale than during the first wave. Third, there will be a drop in potential foreign output growth due to the longer period of uncertainty and the resurgence of the epidemic, which will be gradually reflected in a structural change in the global economic environment. The globalization trend will foster lower growth in economic activity and conversely higher inflation. And the last one, from the foreign side, the negative impacts will fade only very gradually due to a stronger increase in uncertainty and more sustained worse household and business sentiment. From the domestic view, we assume that firstly, the domestic quarantine measures will be renewed from October until Christmas. Assumptions regarding the first wave of the pandemic are the same as in the prolonged pandemic scenario. It means the first one. The second assumption regarding the domestic economy, the second wave of closure and restriction is smaller in both scale and duration than the first one. Third, foreign assumption will have an even more adverse impact on the entire domestic economy, including the labor market, than in the first scenario. And last one, on the fiscal policy, Fiscal policy will be supportive. It means expenditure measures will be introduced to a lesser extent than during the first wave due to the risk of high deficit and rapidly rising debt. The external environment behind our first scenario is following. As you can see, the GDP drop, and you can see this from the top panel, in the pandemic resurgence scenario is so large that some supplier relationship will be fundamentally broken, resulting in upward pressure on selected product prices. The core component of the PPI thus follows roughly the same path this year as in the previous two scenarios. This is in line with the response of oil prices, which lead to a deeper economic contraction with a larger fall. As a result, the energy component of the PPI will be affected more significantly. A graphical representation of PPI is clear from the bottom left panel. We also assume in this scenario that ECB makes unlimited asset purchases but keeps the deposit rate unchanged. The consequences of this assumption is that the 3-month Euribor shadow rate falls much more deeply below zero compared to the previous two scenarios. The development of domestic economy in our second scenario is following. Deglobalization will lead to an even deeper and longer-lasting domestic economic downturn, which you can see from the development of GDP in levels in the top left panel. Lower growth in domestic cost will be reflected in the outlook for inflation, which will temporarily dip below the lower boundary of the tolerance band around the targeted early next year. Please, you can see this from top right panel. Markedly weaker exchange rate and a hypothetical deeply negative path of market interest rate will support a gradual recovery in economic activity and help inflation return to 2% target at the end of next year. The development of both variables is clear from both charts in the bottom panel. It is fair to say that the pandemic resurgence scenario would thus most probably require monetary policy to be eased using an unspecified, unconventional instrument. I would like to thank you for your attention. I trust that these special pandemic restrictions have not reduced the value which you normally receive from our face-to-face presentation in the Czech National Bank. I now give the floor back to spokesperson of the Czech National Bank, Markéta Fischerová. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Luboš, for presenting us the new forecast. If we can turn now to the Q&A part of the session. The first question comes from Helena Horská at Raiffeisen Bank. Helena, you have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you again. And first of all, I'm very sorry for disrupting the beginning of the meeting. The technology is better than me. So sorry for that. And a question, in which scenario is Czech National Bank and Bank Board ready to cut further the counter-cyclical capital buffer? Or in which scenario you are counting with that, and how much the economic outlook has to worsen to cut the counter-cyclical buffer even lower? Thank you.
Okay, I will take that. We didn't have any explicit discussion about counter-cyclical capital buffer at the meeting last Thursday. But of course, we may consider cutting the countercyclical capital buffer further, even if things develop in line with the baseline forecast. We just didn't focus on that topic at this policy meeting. We have scheduled our discussion of the financial stability issues, the financial stability report for June. So I think that's the point of time where we will definitely come to that debate, if not earlier. At this particular meeting that we had last Thursday, we actually discussed other macroprudential measures, and in particular how to exploit the extended mandate of the Czech National Bank to deal in financial market to supply liquidity both to bank and non-bank financial institution, and that was for this meeting the dominant macroprudential part of the debate. So the countercyclical capital buffer may come later. I should probably also say that so far we haven't seen any real deterioration of bank's balance sheet that would require us to cut this countercyclical capital buffer very quickly. But of course, we expect that those bank balance sheet will start to deteriorate, and then at an appropriate moment of time, we are ready to relax the countercyclical buffer potentially down to zero.
Thanks for the question and the answer. And the next who wants to participate in the discussion is Jose Cerveira from JP Morgan. Jose, you have the floor.
Hi, hello. Thank you for organizing the conference call. I wanted to ask Tomáš Holub if he could just walk us through the decision process in the last rate meeting. In the end, a 75 basis point cut was decided, but two people argued for 50. So I just wanted to understand how the board calibrated the final decision. Why 50 instead of 75 or 100? What were the arguments, and how did that process go? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jose, very much for this question. You are right that this was not a unanimous decision. The 50 basis point decision, I would say, would follow from the baseline scenario. That's what's consistent with the baseline. 75 basis points, the decision that we in the end took takes into account something on top of that. The fact that we viewed the risks as skewed towards more monetary policy easing than what's suggested by the baseline. It's basically something that comes from the two alternative scenarios to various degree that we received from the staff. And basically the debate was on whether to go in that direction immediately or whether to do a smaller cut and then wait for the incoming data if they point in the direction of further easing. And in the end, the opinion prevailed that we are still not in a fine-tuning mode of monetary policy, that we are still in a kind of anti-crisis fighting mode, and that we should incorporate the downside risks into the decision already last week. But there was not a strong disagreement between those board members that favored the 50 basis points cut and the others that voted for 75 basis points. That was more about the timing of the easing. Everyone agreed that a very significant monetary easing was required. Thanks.
Thank you. And do we have another question, please? I cannot see anyone at the moment. Yes, Jaromír Šindel from Citi.
Good morning. Thank you for this meeting. I would like to ask you about the wage outlook because you have a relatively strong drop in the economic activity, but the wage growth seems to be quite resilient, at least to me. So this has also some implications for the policy. And the second question would be regarding your fan chart on the interest rate outlook in baseline scenario. You don't have the fan chart in the negative territory. Does it have any signal to us that the CNB doesn't prefer the negative rates to solve the potential disinflationary pressures? Thank you.
So we will take these questions. As for the wage outlook, you have to take into account that we are the starting condition, the initial condition of the economy was characterized by a very, very tight labor market, having seen unemployment rate being close to historical low levels, and with nominal wage growth in business and non-business sector reaching almost 8%. This story is definitely over, but the cooling effect in the labor market will take some time, despite the fact that GDP will collapse by approximately 8% this year. We can expect that unemployment rate will grow relatively gradually over the next couple of months and quarters because of especially two reasons. The first one is the still very high number of vacancies reported by firms to branches of Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, and second, we expect that foreign workers will be laid off first, and that's why the unemployment rate will not go up so quickly. But the cooling labor market could be expected definitely. And there is a second range of arguments saying that we can expect a very volatile profile of year-on-year changes in both private and public sector in terms of developments over the next couple of quarters. And this volatility is driven by statistical effects, leading to the fact that care benefits and people paid during home offices and being under quarantine measures will not be affecting the wage developments during this year, which will be making the observed data relatively weak. That's why we can expect that wage growth in the second quarter will drop below zero, and there will be a carryover effect or base effect being seen in the same period of next year. We had quite intensive discussion about how the wage development will be evolving over time. So this forecast is consistent with the expected gradual renewal of the economic activity to growth and with the initial conditions in the economy. As for the fan chart, we did the same, or we followed the same procedure as we did several years ago when we were approaching zero nominal interest rates from above. Before 2012, 2013, in the baseline scenario, unless anything else is taken or approved in the form of unconventional monetary policy measures, the bottom part of those fans are limited to zero. Which is showing that there is no conventional monetary policy, or there is no room for conventional monetary policy with interest rates going below zero. But as you know, for example, in 2013, when the scenario was the baseline scenario with unlimited interest rate path was showing a need for monetary policy easing, we let's say substituted this unavailable monetary policy room by let's say by initiating unconventional monetary policy tool, which was at those times FX commitment. So this scenario is showing that there is some probability of nominal interest rates reaching zero, but without further discussion and without further decision taken by the board, we do not want to pre-announce any further monetary policy tools, any further monetary policy decisions taken by the possibly taken by the board in the future.
I will follow up on Peter's answers from the policy perspective. As regards the wage outlook, there was some debate on this among the board members, and some of those board members that in the end decided to vote for the 75 basis interest rate cut, some of them expressed their opinion that the slowdown in wage growth could be deeper and more protracted than what is part of the baseline scenario. So it was at least one of the reasons why the majority of the board members in the end decided to cut the rates a little bit more aggressively than what was suggested by the baseline. So it also partly explains or partly responds to the previous question by Jose Cerveira. As regards the interest rate fan chart, definitely my impression is that there is no one on the board for whom negative interest rate would be on top of the list of unconventional monetary policy measures for the Czech economy, but at the same time, most of the board members, as I perceive the situation, wouldn't rule it out at the current stage. So this shape of the fan chart is purely technical, and please don't take it as completely excluding the possibility of negative interest rates going forward. Thank you.
Thanks. And another question will be raised by Jakub Seidler from ING Bank. Jakub, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you very much for presentation. I would like to ask the policymaker a little bit more about the possible Czech Central Bank steps, because zero-hour bound is approaching, and in my view, the policymakers are not very specific about the possible, let's say, preference of other Czech Central Bank tools which might be used if the rates are hitting the zero or lower bound. So basically, I understand that it's not specified in the current adverse scenarios, but still I would assume that the CNB board will be already quite ready to use other tools if necessary. So what is the preference, if it's possible to at least somehow reveal that? Because Mr. Holub already said his own preference in Reuters interview in mid-April. So this kind of expectations would be very needed from the market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jakub, for the question. Yeah, well, a part of the debate was definitely about possible further steps in the unconventional monetary policy space. We have not yet reached the technical zero, so there is a possibility of one more interest rate cut at some of the forthcoming policy meetings before we are at the zero lower bound technically, but of course this remaining space is very limited. So we inevitably had to discuss that at least to some extent. For the moment, the concrete decision was to use the new legal mandate for measures that are more on the macroprudential side than on the macro or monetary policy side, because the liquidity providing facilities that we have announced, this is not meant to be a kind of massive quantitative program. Given the large surplus of liquidity in the Czech banking sector, and so far also the rather stable situation in the non-bank financial system, I wouldn't personally expect a massive take-up from those liquidity providing operations, but they have a very important signaling role that we are here as a backup for financial stability, and this can in itself help to stabilize not just those financial institutions, but also the markets that trade with the collateral that we are going to accept within those liquidity providing operations. Of course, if we get to the zero lower bound and still face major anti-inflationary or even deflationary pressures, we would need to go to a truly unconventional monetary policy space. We asked the staff to speed up preparations for a serious debate by the board on that topic. And so far we had a debate which doesn't allow me to give you a clear preference ordering for all the board members. But definitely measures that were mentioned as possibly on the table could be, of course, first a kind of exchange rate commitment. We have experience with it, and the effectiveness proved to be there. But we also don't exclude quantitative easing or some kind of yield curve control program. A kind of funding for lending program possibly associated with the COVID-3 program of the Czech government. Even the negative rates were mentioned as one possibility. So for the moment, we don't want to exclude anything, and we have asked the staff to prepare a material that would allow us to order this in terms of preferences for different situations. Thanks.
Thank you. And does anyone else wish to say anything? Are there any further points? Because, again, I cannot see anyone who would be asking a question. If not, I would like to close this meeting by expressing our thanks to all our speakers and adding also our thanks to you, to all analysts who have been participating in our video conference today. See you in 3 months' time, and for now, goodbye.
Thank you and stay well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.